Let me just make a brief review in response to some of what I've heard this morning, because I've heard some things that I strenuously disagree with that I think require a response. The thing we all agree on is we're on an unsustainable path. We're borrowing 40 cents of every dollar. That cannot be continued. As I indicated earlier, this is a 60-year look at the spending and revenue of the United States. You can see the spending line is the red line, the green line is the revenue line, and the spending of the United States as a share of national income is the highest it's been in 60 years. The revenue is the lowest it has been in 60 years. Now, some of our colleagues say it's just a spending problem. I just factually reject that. I mean, the facts show it's not just a spending problem, although clearly we do have a spending problem. When spending is the highest it's been in 60 years, clearly you got a spending problem. But as this chart reveals, revenue is the lowest it's been in 60 years. So clearly we've got a revenue problem as well. Now, yesterday we voted on the package that came from the House of Representatives. The package that came from the House Budget Committee was passed by the House of Representatives. And here again this morning, even though that package was defeated overwhelmingly and on a bipartisan basis here yesterday, we had colleagues come and talk about what a great package it was. I don't believe it was a great package. I think it's a terrible package. And here's why. And now I'm quoting former economic advisor to President Reagan. President Reagan's, one of his economic advisors, Mr. Bartlett, said about the House Republican plan the following: distributionally, the Ryan plan is a monstrosity. The rich would receive huge tax cuts while the social safety net would be shredded to pay for them. Even as an opening bid to begin budget negotiations with the Democrats, the Ryan plan cannot be taken seriously. It is less of a wish list than a fairy tale, utterly disconnected from the real world, backed up by make-believe numbers and unreasonable assumptions. Ryan's plan isn't even an act of courage, it's just pandering to the Tea Party. A real act of courage would have been for him to admit, as all serious budget analysts know, that revenues will have to rise well above 19% of GDP to stabilize the debt. Now, this is a former economic advisor to President Reagan commenting on the House Republican plan that we rejected on a bipartisan basis here yesterday. Why does he say it's a monstrosity? Well, he says it because even though revenue is the lowest it's been in 60 years, the first thing the Republican budget from the House did was cut taxes further. An overwhelming tax cut for the wealthiest among us, after they've already enjoyed very significant tax reductions over the last decade. In fact, the plan that came from the Republican plan from the House would have given those who have over $1 million of income a year, on average, a tax cut of over $192,000. For those who are as fortunate as to earn over $10 million a year, the plan that they sent over here would have given them, on average, a tax cut of $1,450,000. Now, that's a fact. That's just a fact. Does that make any sense at all when the revenue of this country is the lowest it's been in 60 years? The first thing you do is dig the hole deeper? Give another $1 trillion of tax cuts going to the wealthiest among us? It makes no sense. It didn't end there, because the plan from the House also would permit the scam that is occurring to continue. And the scam I'm referring to relates to this little building down in the Cayman Islands, Udland House. This little 5-story building down in the Cayman Islands claims to be the home of 18,857 companies. Really? 18,000 companies are doing business out of this little 5-story building down in the Cayman Islands? Please. 18,000 companies aren't doing business out of this little 5-story building down in the Cayman Islands. The only business that's going on is monkey business. And the monkey business that's going on is avoiding the taxes that they legitimately owe to the United States. You wonder why big companies making billions of dollars a year can announce they paid no taxes to the United States? None. It's because they're operating out of Udlin House down in the Cayman Islands where there are no taxes, and they show the profits of their companies down in the Cayman Islands. When I was tax commissioner of my state, I found a company that reported all of their earnings down in the Cayman Islands. They did business all across the country, but amazingly enough, none of those companies showed any profits in the United States. They showed all their profits in the Cayman Islands where, happily, there are no taxes. Now, look, the Republican budget plan said, that's fine, keep doing it. That's not fine. It's not fair. We know from our own permanent committee on investigations here in the United States Senate that these offshore tax havens are proliferating. Here's the quote from our Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Experts have estimated the total loss to the Treasury from offshore tax evasion alone approaches $100 billion a year, including $40 to $70 billion from individuals and another $30 billion from corporations engaging in offshore tax evasion. Abusive tax shelters add tens of billions of dollars more. Mr. President, the Republican plan from the House says, no problem, keep on doing it. In fact, we'll go you one more. We'll give you more tax cuts for the wealthiest among us. I tell you, that plan cannot stand scrutiny. And at the same time, it says, you know, because we've got the lowest revenue in 60 years, and because we're going to give even more tax preferences, more tax credits, more tax schemes to the wealthiest among us, we're not going to be able to keep Medicare. I've heard colleagues say that these draconian cuts to Medicare that are in the House plan are a way of saving Medicare. You don't save Medicare by destroying it. That's what the House plan does, make no mistake. It ends Medicare as we know it. Why do I say that? Well, let me just show you what it does. Right now, under traditional Medicare, the individual pays 25% of their health care costs. That's how it works today. You pay about 25%. A senior citizen eligible for Medicare pays about 25% of their cost. Under the House Republican budget plan that they passed and sent the Senate, that we defeated yesterday by a bipartisan vote, they would increase what the individual pays from 25% to 68%, and they claim they're saving Medicare. Doesn't look to me like they're saving it. Looks to me like they're completely undoing it. And when you add it all up, what is most striking is that the House Republican plan, although it gives massive tax cuts to the wealthiest among us, another $1 trillion of tax cuts, even though it shreds Medicare and completely undermines Medicaid, would mean another 34 million people don't have health care coverage in this country because they completely undo the coverage for health care passed last year. So 34 million people are not going to have health care as a result of their plan. Even with all of that, and the other dramatic cuts, by the way, they cut support for energy programs to reduce our dependence on foreign energy. They cut that 57%. They cut education almost 20%. Even after all that, you'd think, well, at least they got the debt under control. No. Amazingly enough, their plan, according to their own numbers, would add $8 trillion to the debt. Wow. They shred Medicare. They cut education dramatically. They cut almost 60% of the funding for energy to reduce our dependence on foreign energy. They cut that 57%, and they still add $8 trillion to the debt. Wow. That's a good plan? I don't think so. I don't think that's a plan that can stand much scrutiny. Mr. President, we also heard a lot of complaints from the other side that we've not gone to markup on the budget here in the Senate. That's true. And the reason we haven't is because something is going on in this town that's very unusual. There are high-level, bipartisan talks going on with the White House on what the budget plan should be to deal with our debt. This is something I've encouraged for years. I've called repeatedly this year for a summit to deal with our debt, to get a plan in place to cut spending and, yes, to raise revenue, hopefully without raising taxes, but by eliminating tax expenditures, tax loopholes, this kind of scam we've just talked about, offshore tax havens and abusive tax shelters. And Mr. President, that bipartisan leadership effort that is underway deserves a chance to succeed. If they reach a conclusion, they will need a budget resolution. They will need us to have a markup in the Budget Committee to implement their plan. Some don't want to wait. They don't want a bipartisan agreement. But we simply must have a bipartisan agreement if there is to be any chance for success. The House is controlled by the Republicans. The Senate is controlled by the Democrats. There is a Democrat in the White House. The only possible way that a plan is actually passed into law and implemented is if we work together. I did it for all of last year on the President's Commission. I've done it 4 months of this year with 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, spending hundreds of hours trying to come up with a bipartisan plan here to implement the recommendations of the Commission. So I don't take a back seat to anybody with respect to being serious about trying to get a plan to get our debt under control, because it's a fundamental threat to the economic security of the United States. But here's what the Republican leader himself said about the effort that is underway, the bipartisan leadership effort. The discussions that can lead to a result between now and August are the talks being led by Vice President Biden. That's a process that could lead to a result, a measurable result. And in that meeting is the only Democrat who can sign a bill into law. In fact, the only American out of 307 million of us who can sign a bill into law. He is in those discussions. That will lead to a result. That is why we have not gone to a budget markup, because we have the patience to wait for the outcome of these bipartisan leadership talks. Top Republicans are represented in the Senate. Top Republicans in the House are represented, as are the Democrats in the Senate and the House, led by the White House. Mr. President, the Republican leader said this as well about the talks. We now have the most important Democrat in America at the table. That's important. He is the only one of the 307 million of us who can actually sign a bill into law. And I think that's a step in the right direction. And the Biden group is the group that can actually reach a decision on a bipartisan basis. And if it reaches a decision, obviously, we'll be recommending it to our members. Mr. President, that is the point. Why would we go to a partisan budget markup and refuse to wait for the leadership negotiation that is underway to succeed, when we know if they do succeed, in all likelihood, they will need us to do a budget markup to implement what they decide? Mr. President, I have the patience. I've spent 5 years working first with Senator Gregg, the ranking Republican on the Budget Committee, then with all 18 members of the Fiscal Commission, now with a group of 6, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, trying to put together a plan to implement what the Commission recommended to get our debt under control. I have the patience to wait a few more weeks to see if the combined leadership of this country, Republican and Democrat, working with the President of the United States, can come up with a plan to get our debt under control. We should all have that patience. We should all hope that they succeed. But we're not just going to be sitting and waiting. While we're hoping for a successful outcome, this senator will continue to work with Republicans and Democrats to come up with a bipartisan plan to meet our debt threat. All of us have that obligation. All of us have that responsibility. I thank the chair and yield the floor.